Welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Greg Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reske.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
On this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast, we are going to revisit just some basic truths about the gospel, but they're huge and they're so important. In fact, we're going to talk about making a paradigm shift. Let's just dive in. Jim, you messaged me about a guy named Thomas Kuhn. Who's he and what does that have to do with the paradigm shift?
Yeah, so thanks, Greg. First of all, great to be with you. Happy to we can have this kind of opportunity to do these podcasts together. So just love it. So one thing we were talking about was the whole idea of what does it mean to become a Christian? And so many times in the Bible, when Jesus talks about, coming to Christ, or he talks about just coming to faith, he'll say things like, you have to open your eyes. And you think about, was it Saul, when it became Saul's conversion? It's something like the book of Acts says something like scales fell from his eyes. And when Jesus is healing people, there's a blind man is healing people, and then as he heals people, there's a strong comparison to the Pharisees who are spiritually blinded right there. So there's a metaphor of him opening someone's eyes, and yet the Pharisees are still blinded. And so much of that is the whole metaphor that comes up again and again is open your eyes that you may see. And what I think that means is something that's like a classic paradigm shift. Now, and almost any one of our listeners, many of them would have heard of this book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by a guy named Thomas Kuhn. When I went to graduate school, it was like the first semester you have to read this book. And I think it's just, it was responsible for making the whole idea of the word paradigm and paradigm shifts very popular. And his basic premise, I think he wrote this in the 50s or 60s, a while ago, but his basic premise was that people see everything they see through a paradigm, through a lens, and they interpret everything they hear through that lens. And in the way science has progressed is not through slow accumulation of knowledge, it's through periodic massive paradigm shifts. So everybody in the scientific world is seeing all the data around them because they're seeing it through the lens that the world is flat. And they're interpreting everything they see through the world is flat. And so they get contradictory evidence of that view. They say, well, it doesn't quite fit. They keep reinterpreting it until suddenly the shift comes, say, wait a second, let's look at everything totally different. Different paradigm. And the classic example in his book, I think people talk about, is the idea, kind of like the Earth being flat, that the Earth is the center of the universe and all the stars revolve around the Earth. The Earth, the sun, everything revolves around the Earth. And scientists just took that as given for millennia, right? That's just the way it is, and you can see it. And so they looked up and really did observations. You say, well, there's a couple of stars that don't fit that pattern. They keep going back and forth. They keep moving around. Obviously, now we know those are the planets, right? But they did all kinds of mental gymnastics to stay with the paradigm that the Earth was the center of the universe, and yet observe this data that didn't fit that paradigm, but reinterpret it and say, well, they have their own little mini orbits that circle around each other and crazy stuff to make it all work, until finally science revolves where Copernicus comes and says, wait a second, maybe the Earth isn't the center of the universe. Maybe we revolve around the sun. And if you see everything through that new lens, suddenly all the movements of the stars make complete sense. But it wasn't a gradual increase of knowledge or, progression of knowledge. It was a sudden paradigm shift. And then the establishment resisted, of course, until finally everyone capitulates and says, yeah, that's the only way to see the world. It makes much more sense of everything you see. And coming to Christ is like that. So when you come to Christ, you say, suddenly the things you thought were important aren't important anymore. The things you thought were driving your life aren't driving your life anymore. The things you thought were real aren't so real anymore. And so just everyone on this podcast who's a Christian knows that, right? You would all say, when I became a Christian, I felt like my eyes were open. Suddenly I could see things for the first time. And then what you and I talk about in this podcast is the notion that the gospel isn't just the start of your Christian life, it's the whole Christian life. And so the way I've thought about that in my own life, Greg, is that I was a Christian most of my life, but I didn't really get the gospel and understand that the gospel was the driver for the whole Christian life until I was in my 30s. And then it felt like being born again. And when I say born again, what I mean is I could say like yet another paradigm shift to say, that's how the gospel works. And that's why I've been so motivated to kind of start writing this book to kind of explain some of this illustration that shows this. We won't go into that today. But last time you were kind enough to let us talk about what was chapter 4 of the book, Augustine and Pelagius, and that debate. And now some of these thoughts I write about are in chapter 5, the very next chapter. And what we're doing is talking about that kind of paradigm. What I do in the book is talk about that kind of paradigm shift and how you, because of that, whenever the gospel really gets you and your eyes are open to how the gospel works in your Christian life, not just for the start of the Christian life, but the whole Christian life. When that gets you, suddenly you start seeing everything differently. And every book of the Bible is totally different. And they're all new and they're all exciting and different. And that's that verse in Lamentations 2:23, how your mercies are new every morning. And they are, because you say, holy cow, I've read this book of Jonah forever, and I thought I had a nice lesson about the fish. And now I see it's something that I never saw before. And so that's the importance of paradigm shifts. And I think maybe the intro of what we might want to talk about tonight.
Sounds fascinating. I'm curious, like, well, first of all, you made me think of a couple of different things. One is that Jesus, I remember as a young Christian and reading the Gospels, and when Jesus would say, "He who has ears, let him hear."
Yes.
And he would say that, like, he said that over and over and over again. And I was like,
yes.
Why is he saying that? He who has ears, let him hear. Everybody has ears. And it's sort of the same thing, right? Even though we have ears, we may not be hearing it from the right perspective or hearing the true message.
Oh,
and
yeah.
then the other thing you made me think of is, I talk a lot in my ministry about worldviews, because I deal with students from all different types of religious backgrounds, and how everyone has a different worldview, and those worldviews are almost like sunglasses. And so,
right.
People from America are wearing, red tinted sunglasses, and people from India are wearing blue tinted. And it's the way you view the world. You're seeing the world through those sunglasses. And it's so helpful to, first of all, recognize your own worldview.
Yeah.
And then try to understand other people's worldview as well. But what you're talking about is really, really important, because you're saying, hey, you're not saying that you didn't understand the gospel when you, in the first place, you understood it as far as for your salvation. That's
right.
Why do you think the shift didn't happen?
I don't know, because I part of my story we talk about all the time is that I became a Christian at an early age, was trying to live the best Christian life I possibly could, trying so hard to be a good Christian, and felt so burned out on that, feeling like this is, and what I've said before is, it still believed it, but wouldn't recommend it to anybody because it was just so hard to do all this all the time. And we started going to Tim Keller's church, Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City, and listening to Tim Keller talk for several years, thinking, wow, he's really good. This is really interesting, but didn't catch why it was different. And I was, the word comes to mind as being inoculated. I thought I knew it because I had some knowledge of the gospel. So when you talk about the gospel is important to Christian life, yes. I know all about that. I know all about it. I was raised this way. I know, I understand Jesus died for my sins. Yes. I want to move past that. And I didn't. It took so long, Greg, to get to the idea, like, no, that's not, the gospel is not just for the start of your Christian life. It's for the whole thing.
And I think I have a similar experience. I know for sure that, for many, many years. And the way I think of it, Jim, is that the default setting of the human heart is so strong, and it's so much towards self-justification, hard work, and effort.
Yeah.
And so what we don't realize is, even though when we receive salvation, when we hear the gospel and we respond to it, we really understand what Jesus did for us, it's amazing. And it's like that default switch, like, we realize it and we just run to Jesus. But then that the we go right back to our default settings.
Yeah.
But instead of in a secular context, we apply them in a religious context. And
Yes.
so it's all about being the best Christian I could ever be.
Yeah.
I remember one time I had a conversation with my brother, and I said something like, I want to be a good Christian. And my brother kind of gave me a hard time. He's like, good Christian? That's that's an oxymoron. I mean, we're not trying to be good. And that's stuck with me, So
that's great.
So
wait, but you're right about I love when you say that is the default setting of human heart. It's religiosity, right? Tell me the rules and I can do it. There's that story in the New Testament where the rich young ruler comes to Jesus and he says, what must I do to be saved? Jesus says, keep all the commandments. He says, yeah, right. I've done all that. What else do I do? Like, just give me the rules and I can follow it. And every religion does work that way. There's a set of rules and you follow it. That's why it's so simple to grasp and easy to understand. So you come to Christianity, maybe with the same lens. You say, great, Jesus started me off, washed my sins away, death on the cross. I need to trust in that for my sins. Yes, I believe that. Now give me the rules and I'll follow them. And I'll, back to the default setting of the human heart. I'll work really hard at this. Let me show you what I can do. And I don't know, Greg, maybe I love your thing about the sunglasses. That's an easier way to explain paradigms than talking about Thomas Kuhn and the structure of scientific revolutions. It's just the sunglasses, right? So you put those on and you see the world totally differently. But just one quick more thought. I love what your brother said about not being a good Christian, because that's not the message of Christianity at all, right? It's not that we're good people. We're like horrific sinners that Jesus had to redeem, right? And we're so far gone that God himself had to pay the price and die for us. But again, the power of these lenses, these sunglasses, you could explain that to somebody else and someone would say, as you're talking about how deep a sinner you are, they'll hear you and say, oh, you think you got all the answers. You got it all figured out, right? So.
Right. Yeah. So, one of the things you mentioned, you talked about the book of Jonah. And one of the issues that I see in the church and among so many Christians, if you don't make the shift, then you just read the Bible and it's full of heroes or examples we should follow. Or
that's right.
We read it through the sunglasses of our default setting,
right?
Which is, I got to be like, David and slay Goliath, and
that's right.
I got to be like Abraham and walk by faith. And so let's talk a little bit about the book of Jonah.
And I think Jonah's a good example, because I think you're right. You read these stories and say, what is a lesson for me? And usually you think these are great heroes. That's why there's a story about them. So I need to be like this person, follow their example, and do what they did. And Jonah is one where you say the whole point of the story is about his inability to make the shift. He's one that has every opportunity to make the shift. Now, and we're talking about the second shift. He's a prophet. Obviously, he's a believer, right?
He should be a believer. If
right.
You're a prophet, you think you'd have a relationship with God.
Yeah, and in the book, he has direct dialogue with God himself. I mean, so this is not somebody who does not believe, right? This is a believer, but the point of the book is he should maybe making this secondary shift to see the world the way God sees it, and he just doesn't. And it's not an example for saying I need to be more like Jonah. Like, you need to learn a lesson from that. Like, there's another shift to be made here, and Jonah never does make it. So
it's true. So should we?
Let's dig in.
Yeah. So you could summarize the book of Jonah in 4 different acts, which are like the 4 chapters of the book of Jonah. And I love what you just said about Jonah is one of those characters that it's like, I don't know that you really want to try to be like Jonah, although God gives him a second chance, and he does take God up on it, but kind of reluctantly, and it doesn't. We'll get to what happens there. But the first act, or chapter 1, God comes to Jonah and says, hey, I want you to go to this city called Nineveh and preach against it. And so he gives Jonah a ministry assignment, basically. And Jonah's like, no, I don't really like those people, so I'm going to go in the opposite direction. So he gets on a ship, and then heading towards Spain, essentially.
Right.
And then he goes down and falls asleep on the ship, but there's a huge storm on the ocean. And sailors on the ship think they're going to drown, and they're trying to figure out who's responsible for this. And then they figure out like it's Jonah's fault. So they wake him up, and basically he's like, "Yep, it's my fault. I'm running away from God. I'm not doing what He's telling me to do. What you have to do is throw me overboard." And they're like, "Well, we don't want to throw you overboard. That would, we don't want to do that. You'll die."
Right.
And eventually the storm is so bad that they're desperate. So they just listen and throw him overboard. And then, so then you think that's it. Jonah's gone. He's dead. But he sinks down into the ocean, and he gets swallowed by a huge fish. And what's interesting about the second act, or chapter 2, is it's basically everything in that act is about him inside this fish, and his thoughts and his prayers. And it seems like his life kind of turns around. First of all, he's surprised that he's alive. And he realized, in chapter 2, verse 7, he says, when my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. And then he has then he says this, the next verse, which this is one of my favorite verses in this book, is chapter 2, verse 8. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I vowed, I will make good. Salvation comes from the Lord. That's actually verses 8 and 9. And it's like you think, oh my gosh, he's made it. He's turned around. He's figured it out. And his
eyes are opened. His eyes are opened, right? And that is a great. And by the way, that verse, 2 verse 9, salvation is from the Lord, is huge. So it's a great verse in the book of Jonah, where you realize salvation is not something I'm earning; it is received. It's from the Lord, right?
Yeah.
Huge verse. But that's in the belly of the fish, and that's the part of the story that everybody, kids that go through a church tradition and go to Sunday school will remember the part about Jonah and the fish. And this is you're right, this is the famous part.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.